The Trump administration is seeing a mass exodus of legal talent. More than 10,000 government lawyers have left since the beginning of 2025, according to a New York Times analysis. Now, as one former lawyer put it, it's leaving some agencies without the staff to get stuff done. But President Trump is calling this a very good thing, writing on Truth Social, quote, "The people who are leaving are radical left deep state lunatics who are destroying our country." Joining us now, Jim Messina, former White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations and campaign manager for Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin is here in studio with me. Lisa, just can you even quantify what the real life consequences are of losing 10,000 government lawyers?
It's staggering, Chris. And in some departments, according to the New York Times, that loss is particularly pernicious. I'm just looking at a chart that they put together with their reporting. The education department, for example, has lost more than 50% of their lawyers between December of 2024 and March of 2026.
Hey folks, John here. Nobody told me about this either. A quiet pattern of departures has accelerated in Trump's second term. DOJ lawyers resigning rather than making unsupportable election claims, state officials certifying results over his objections, and senior officials speaking out. The Supreme Court's immunity ruling has also deepened splits in his legal team, exposing where his coalition is quietly coming apart. Let me be upfront about the framing, because the title of this video uses the phrase shock ruling, and I want to be honest about what that means in this context. There is not one single dramatic moment where a court ruling on elections causes a wave of senior officials to simultaneously walk out of the room in a coordinated break. That is not how these things work. What there is, documented across years, across courts, across multiple states and multiple federal investigations, is a sustained pattern of judicial and investigative findings that keep reaching the same basic conclusion.
That means at certain of these departments, there are not enough lawyers to just get the basic work of the department done. And of course, we have been covering here at MS Now for many months the decimation of career ranks at the Department of Justice. This is taking a much broader look at the federal government as a whole. The Justice Department actually falls fairly low on this list in terms of departments that have lost lawyers. They're down 21%. But across the whole government, the federal government, the loss of these lawyers means a loss of expertise that really matters. And, you know, I hear that the president is saying that radical leftists are now out of the government. I'm not sure how many radical leftists were lawyers at the Agriculture Department, but, you know, maybe he can tell us differently.
Yeah, Jim, according to the New York Times, a lot of the lawyers interested in public service are now going instead to the offices of Democratic state attorneys general, to nonprofits that are challenging the administration's policies in court. You got to wonder if this could backfire in more ways than one.
Boy, you really do. You know, when I was Deputy Chief of Staff at the White House, you realize across government, you have the finest career people.
The fraud claims are not supported by evidence. The pressure on officials to change results was improper. The constitutional and statutory limits on presidential authority over elections are real and will be enforced. And each iteration of that finding, each new ruling, each new investigation, each new court opinion puts more pressure on the people inside Trump's orbit, who understand what the law actually says. And over time, that pressure has been producing departures, public contradictions, testimony against him, and the steady narrowing of his inner circle to the people who are willing to keep going, regardless of what the courts and the evidence say. That is the pattern. And today we are going to walk through exactly how it has played out and why it matters for where things are heading. All right, so let us go through the documented evidence of the parting ways pattern.
That you can possibly imagine who are spending their life making way less than they could in the private sector because they believe in America. And you also realize you can't get anything done in these places without good lawyers. And hollowing out the legal talent across the entire spectrum of the government, to Lisa's point, it's not just DOJ, it's all over the place. And now what you're seeing is these organizations can't get anything done. What is the number one thing voters want? They want government to work again. They want government to move fast. They want government to care about them. None of that is happening when you hollow out these ranks. And to your point, where you're actually seeing the real work done on holding this administration accountable is now the state attorneys generals. And so a lot of them went to the state attorneys generals and said, hey, let me continue my work with you. And I think that's been a very good thing. And you're seeing the state attorney generals actually hold Donald Trump accountable for his actions.
Is this the kind of thing that's messageable on the campaign trail, Jim? I mean, if Democrats, let's say, regain power, do they talk about how to fix it? Is the goal simply to restore the federal government to what it was like before Trump? Or could this be an opportunity to talk about building something new and, one would hope, better?
Because the specific moments that illustrate it tell a story that is more revealing than any general characterization. Let us start with 2020 because that is where the pattern begins in its clearest and most documented form. After Joe Biden won the presidential election, Trump and his allies filed approximately 60 lawsuits in state and federal courts across the key swing states, claiming fraud, illegal procedures, and improperly counted ballots. The scope of the legal campaign was unprecedented. More election lawsuits in more jurisdictions in a shorter period of time than any previous presidential candidate had ever filed. And the result was also unprecedented. The lawsuits failed in virtually every court that heard them, not because judges were hostile to Trump personally or politically motivated against him.
It's absolutely an opportunity. Part of what Democrats have to be seen as people that can reform government, that can make government move faster, that can make government produce things for the American public. And this gives us an opportunity to say, hey, how do we reimagine this? Whoever the next president of the United States is going to walk into a completely broken government. And that'll be a really difficult task. But it's also an opportunity, Chris, to reimagine it and make it move faster and better.
What's harder to rebuild? Here's a Rubik's Cube of a question, Jim. Public trust in government or talented people willing to work there?
Both. And the problem is you can't restore trust if you don't have talented people. You know, Barack Obama always says, he's like, I want people around me who get things done, who are doers. And now we have a whole lot less doers that can reform government. And I think that is a very big challenge. Even if you have all the best intentions in the world, as Lisa well knows, you still need really competent people around you who can get this stuff done. And we just got rid of tens of thousands of them at exactly the wrong time.
The judges who dismissed these cases included Republican appointees who had been confirmed with Republican Senate votes and who had no particular incentive to rule against the Republican president. They dismissed the cases because the legal teams presenting them could not produce credible evidence of the widespread fraud they were claiming. Court after court found the same thing, that when you got past the rhetoric and the affidavits and the press conferences and actually showed the evidence to a judge who applied legal standards, there was not there. The historical record of the 2020 election lawsuits documents how the cases fell apart in jurisdiction after jurisdiction on exactly those grounds. And then there was Georgia. The story of what happened in Georgia in the weeks after the 2020 election is one of the most significant and most documented examples of Trump election pressure colliding with officials who chose the law over loyalty. Brad Raffensperger was the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia, a conservative official who had been a reliable member of the Georgia Republican establishment for years. Trump called him. You have heard the recording. Find 11,780 votes. That is what Trump asked for on a recorded phone call with the state's top election official. And Raffensperger said no. His office certified Georgia's results for Biden, and then he and Georgia's Republican election officials cooperated with the subsequent investigations, testifying about what they had experienced, what they had been asked to do, and why they had refused. That decision to certify over Trump's objections and then to cooperate with investigators is the clearest example of what the parting ways pattern looks like when it happens at the state level. Raffensperger was not a liberal. He was not a Trump opponent looking for an opportunity to undermine him. He was a Republican election official who looked at what he was being asked to do, understood what the law required, and chose the law. And for that choice, he became a target of Trump's attacks and of harassment from Trump's base that has been specifically documented as one of the consequences that has been driving experienced election officials out of public service entirely. Similar patterns played out in Arizona and Pennsylvania. Republican county and statewide officials certifying results over Trump's objections, becoming targets of his attacks, and in many cases, becoming witnesses in subsequent investigations. A major report documenting what it called Trump's campaign to undermine the next election described how that pressure has played out at the state level in the years since 2020. Tactics including pressuring state legislators to change rules to favor Trump, amplifying false claims of fraud to justify new voter restrictions, and backing local officials who refuse to certify valid elections. The report concludes that the campaign is unprecedented in modern history and that it is actively eroding public confidence in the electoral system. But it also documents the resistance. The officials who refused to go along, who certified results over objection, who cooperated with investigations, and who in doing so separated themselves from Trump's narrative in ways that carry significant legal weight going forward. Now let us talk about the DOJ dimension, because the election-related pressure on career Justice Department lawyers is the federal-level version of the same pattern that played out at the state level. A major investigation into the year of chaos inside Trump's Justice Department documented how staff attorneys were reassigned or left as Trump pushed the department to investigate and support his election narratives. Reporting on the erosion of DOJ experience noted that many career lawyers resigned or were forced out rather than defend what they saw as politically driven or legally weak cases, including cases connected to election claims. And former DOJ officials who went on television to explain why they resigned described exactly the same dynamic as the state election officials, being asked to do things they believe the law did not support and choosing the law over the political pressure. The broader DOJ lawyer departure numbers are staggering. Thousands of attorneys gone in a short period. 70% of the Civil Rights Division, 2/3 of the Federal Programs Branch. The election-related pressure was not the only cause of those departures, but it was part of the pattern that accelerated the hemorrhaging of experienced professional lawyers from the institution. Lawyers who understood election law, who understood what the evidence actually showed about 2020, and who were not willing to keep making arguments they believed were not legally supportable. Now let us look at the Supreme Court immunity ruling, because this is the case that has the most direct implications for how the election-related criminal charges against Trump are going to proceed. The court held that a former president does not have blanket criminal immunity for all acts taken while in office, that the presidency does not create a total shield against criminal prosecution. It did carve out some protections for what it called official acts, certain categories of presidential conduct that are protected even from criminal prosecution. But the court made clear that those protections do not extend to everything. And critically, the opinion suggested that efforts to block the certification of election results or to interfere with the counting of votes can be treated as potentially criminal conduct rather than protected official acts. That specific suggestion in the text of a Supreme Court opinion is what triggered the strategic splits in Trump's legal team, because it changes the legal landscape in ways that make certain arguments that had previously been available now much more difficult to sustain. And different lawyers have different views on how to navigate that changed landscape, which itself produces the kind of internal disagreement that leads to attorneys departing from the legal team as their advice is rejected in favor of alternative strategies. Now let us zoom out and look at the broader assessment of what the ongoing campaign to undermine elections means for Trump's political sustainability. The conclusion that the campaign is unprecedented in modern history is not just a political judgment. It is an institutional assessment. When you pressure state election officials to certify results they know are not accurate, when you target and harass the officials who refuse to go along until they leave public service, when you use the DOJ to investigate claims that your own lawyers know are not supported by the evidence, and when you build a political ecosystem that treats election denial as a loyalty test, you are doing specific and measurable damage to the institutional infrastructure of American democracy. And you are also doing specific and measurable damage to your own coalition. Because the people who understand election law, who understand what the evidence actually shows, who cannot reconcile what they are being asked to do with their professional obligations, keep leaving. The inner circle gets smaller. The people who remain are the ones who are willing to keep going regardless. And the people who left are now witnesses, available to investigators, available to prosecutors, available to congressional oversight committees, available to journalists with specific and detailed knowledge of what they were asked to do and why they refused. Now let us connect this to the broader pattern, because the election-related departures fit the same template as every other departure pattern we have covered. When Trump pushes against institutional limits, legal limits, constitutional limits, professional ethical limits, a consistent and predictable response follows. The people who understand where those limits are and who are not willing to help push past them leave. They leave the DOJ, they leave state election offices, they leave the legal team, they leave the administration when they are asked to implement policies they cannot defend to a court. And every departure is both a sign of the pressure that is being applied and a weakening of the capacity to sustain that pressure without consequences. Because the people who leave take knowledge with them, they take professional credibility with them, and often they take willingness to talk with them. Okay, so let us lay out what the overall pattern of election-related official departures and breaks actually means and why it matters for where Trump's political situation is heading. The first thing to understand is the institutional significance of the state election officials who certified results over Trump's objections and then cooperated with investigations. Brad Raffensperger and his Georgia counterparts, the Arizona and Pennsylvania officials who made the same choice, are not just historical footnotes. They are witnesses. They have testified under oath about what they were asked to do and what they saw and heard. That testimony is part of the evidentiary record in the Georgia criminal case and in other investigations. It does not disappear. It does not become less relevant because Trump is now back in the White House. And the pattern of what they describe, direct presidential pressure on state officials to produce different election results, specific requests like find 11,780 votes, is documented in recordings and in sworn testimony in ways that cannot be explained away by claiming the officials are political opponents making things up. They were Republicans. They certified results that went against their party's presidential candidate. They faced harassment and death threats from Trump's own base as a result, and they cooperated with investigators anyway. That specific combination of facts, the refusal to comply, the cooperation with investigations, the personal cost they paid for both, is what makes their account so credible and so legally significant. The second layer we're sitting with is what the ongoing pattern of departures from the DOJ, from legal teams, from election administration at the state level means for the talent and credibility available to Trump's election-related legal strategy going forward. The DOJ has been hemorrhaging experienced career lawyers who understand complex legal terrain. The specific subset of those lawyers who understood election law, who knew what the evidence from 2020 showed, who understood what claims were and were not legally supportable, left at particularly high rates because the pressure to make legally unjustifiable claims was especially intense in election-related matters. What fills that gap is people who are there because of their loyalty and their ideological alignment rather than their legal expertise. And in a courtroom in front of a judge who has read the prior cases, who understands what the evidentiary standard is, who has perhaps already seen Trump's lawyers make arguments that did not hold up, the decline in legal quality that comes from replacing expertise with loyalty becomes visible and consequential. The 60-plus lawsuits that failed in 2020 were a preview of what happens when the legal strategy is driven by what the client wants to claim rather than by what the evidence and the law actually support. The people who understood that distinction have largely left. The people who remain are the ones who are willing to keep going anyway, and that is a recipe for more court losses. The third layer is what the Supreme Court immunity ruling specifically means for the trajectory of the election-related criminal cases that are still pending or being contemplated. The court's determination that trying to block certification or interfere with vote counting can be treated as potentially criminal conduct rather than protected official acts is a legal finding that substantially narrows the most powerful defense argument that Trump's team had been developing. The blanket immunity argument that everything a president does in the exercise of presidential power is protected from criminal prosecution was the argument that, if accepted, would have made prosecution essentially impossible for most of what happened around January 6th. The court rejected it. It did not reject presidential immunity entirely. It preserved some protections for official acts. But the suggestion that election interference-related conduct falls on the unofficial act side of the line and therefore is not protected is what is producing the strategic disagreements inside Trump's legal team. Different lawyers have different views on how to navigate the narrower immunity framework the court established. And when lawyers disagree about strategy in a criminal case with stakes this high, those disagreements tend to produce departures, as the lawyers whose advice is not being followed decide they would rather leave than be associated with a strategy they think is wrong. Now, to give the complete picture, Trump and his supporters have a consistent and strongly held response to the entire election-related narrative that deserves to be acknowledged. They argue that the 2020 election was genuinely problematic, that legitimate concerns about the integrity of the process were raised and then dismissed too quickly by courts and officials who were unwilling to examine the evidence seriously. They argue that the Raffensperger phone call has been mischaracterized, that Trump was asking for an audit of legal votes, not for illegal vote manufacturing. They argue that the DOJ lawyer departures reflect political opposition from career staff who are never neutral and who are going to resist any Republican administration. And they argue that assessments from organizations like the Brennan Center are the work of liberal advocacy groups that start with their conclusions and work backward to find evidence. These arguments are made sincerely and are believed deeply by a significant portion of the American electorate. And some of them, particularly the argument that concerns about the 2020 election were sometimes dismissed too quickly, reflect genuine debates about process and transparency that are worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as pure bad faith. But here is what those arguments run into when you apply them to the specific documented record. The 60-plus lawsuits filed in 2020 were not dismissed by partisan liberal judges who refused to look at evidence. They were dismissed by judges across the ideological spectrum, including Republican appointees in Republican-led states, who found that the legal teams presenting the cases could not produce evidence that met the legal standard for the relief they were requesting. That is a specific finding about the quality and nature of the evidence, not a political judgment about the validity of concerns. Brad Raffensperger was not a liberal opponent who was looking for an excuse to certify against Trump. He was a Republican state official who reviewed what his office had found, concluded it was accurate, and certified it, even after being personally called by the President of the United States and asked to find more votes. The recording of that call exists. The conversation is documented, and his testimony about what happened is part of an official evidentiary record. And the Supreme Court's immunity ruling was not written by justices hostile to Trump. It was written by a court with a conservative majority that included 3 Trump appointees, and it still rejected the blanket immunity claim. These are not partisan findings. These are institutional determinations made by people in institutions with their own credibility and their own professional stakes in getting the analysis right. So here is the bottom line on all of this. Courts across the country in 60-plus cases found that the 2020 fraud claims were not supported by sufficient evidence. Republican state election officials in Georgia, Arizona, and Pennsylvania certified results over Trump's pressure and objections and cooperated with subsequent investigations. DOJ lawyers who understood election law left rather than make arguments they believed were legally unjustifiable. The Supreme Court rejected blanket presidential immunity for election interference-related conduct, narrowing Trump's strongest legal defense. And researchers have documented an ongoing campaign to undermine future elections that has cost Trump experienced lawyers, cooperative state partners, and GOP officials who have chosen the law over loyalty. Each piece of that pattern represents another departure, another person or institution that understood what was being asked of them, evaluated it against their professional and legal obligations, and said no. The inner circle of people willing to keep going regardless has gotten smaller. The circle of people who have left and are now witnesses has gotten larger. And the accumulation of official rulings, sworn testimony, and documented departures is building a historical and legal record that will not go away when this administration ends. The parting of ways is ongoing. And with each court ruling that rejects another claim, the pressure on the remaining inner circle, the pressure to be one of the ones who finally says this has gone far enough, gets a little more intense. The implications of this pattern extend far beyond the immediate legal proceedings. What we're witnessing is a fundamental realignment of the relationship between the presidency and the institutional guardrails that are supposed to constrain it. When a president repeatedly tests the limits of what is legally permissible and finds that the people who are supposed to enforce those limits either leave or are pushed out, the institutional capacity to resist future overreaches is diminished. And each departure, each resignation, each refusal to certify, each court ruling that rejects a claim, chips away at the assumption that the system will hold. But there is another side to this story that is equally important. The people who have left, who have refused, who have testified, they are not just gone. They are out there telling their stories, building a record, providing evidence. The Raffenspergers of the world are not silent. The former DOJ lawyers are not silent. The officials who certified results over objections are not silent. They are speaking, and their testimony is accusers. But when the people who used to be on your side start telling stories that contradict your narrative, that is much harder to dismiss. The people who left are not all political opponents. Many of them were Republicans. Many of them supported Trump at one point. Many of them worked for him. And they are now saying, in sworn testimony and public interviews, that what they were asked to do crossed a line. That is powerful evidence. It is powerful because it comes from people who have no obvious incentive to lie. They are not getting paid for their testimony. They are not seeking political office. They are not trying to become famous. They are just telling the truth about what they experienced. And their truth is devastating. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a president whose inner circle is shrinking, whose legal team is fracturing, whose institutional partners are departing, and whose legal defenses are narrowing. It leaves us with a growing body of evidence that contradicts the narratives he has been promoting. And it leaves us with a political system that is increasingly strained by the pressure of a president who is willing to push against every limit and a growing number of people who are no longer willing to go with him. The parting of ways is real, and it is accelerating. And the next chapter of this story is going to be determined by what happens when the remaining inner circle faces the next test. But hey, if you think the election-related departures and the immunity ruling are the most consequential legal developments affecting Trump's ability to manage his political future right now, wait until we get into what is happening with the specific criminal cases that the immunity ruling left most vulnerable and what the prosecutors in those cases are doing with the new legal landscape the Supreme Court created. Because the immunity ruling did not end those cases. It changed what arguments are available. And the new arguments the other side now gets to make are significantly more powerful than what they had before. That story is coming next, and you are going to want to be here for it. The pattern of departures and court rulings is building a permanent historical record of Trump's era. Every resignation and testimony adds to a case that will be studied for years, and I'll keep tracking the truth behind the narrative as it unfolds.